All right. Well, thank you for joining me. So first, just I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on Canada's performance in the Worldwide Educating for the Future Index. I don't know if you all caught that when the results were on screen, but it came in second, a very close second to New Zealand. Just kind of just get your thoughts about the index in general and where you think
Yeah.
Canada performed well.
Well, we certainly aren't surprised by the results because we've been intentional in terms of the work that's gone on in specifically in Ontario. Um, Let me just sort of frame that in terms of just giving some context, because the global situation in Ontario has not been lost. And we recognize, and that's why this is a really interesting event as well. I think that Dr. Charles Chan certainly has a great vision in terms of where this ought to go. We recognize that students that entered, for example, kindergarten today, by the time they graduate, the world will be in 2030. So that's about 12 years, 13 years from now. And in 50 years, those students will in fact have just finished their work life in 2070. And so, who we educate, how we educate, and for what purpose is an important piece that we need to kind of pay attention to. And I think what the index does is pay attention to some of those pieces as well. And we also recognize, in terms of just simply the global population, we know that in 12 years from now, the global population, there'll be another billion people on the planet. And those billion people, the chances that they're going to be, those faces will be white North American or European is probably highly unlikely. And so that sense of diversification in our schools is quite prevalent. And so we spend a lot of time also addressing the issues of equity. And so given the situation around the index and what was presented, we're not surprised by it at all, in the sense that from the three areas that you articulated, starting with the whole area of policy, in our Education Act, actually in Ontario, one of the pieces, part of the Education Act, is that we will educate both for achievement and for well-being. And that's right in the Act. So this notion that, there is an inextricable link between achievement and well-being is an important context. And so we pay attention to that. The other piece that we pay attention to is the whole area of equity. And we recognize that equity of outcomes for all. And so we educate all. The public system in Ontario educates over 95% of the students. Just less than 5% is educated by the private, in private schools, so to speak. And so we pay great attention to the whole notion of equity and that notion of educating for all. So that particular piece was of interest for us. The second piece around teachers was also of interest to us. And we have what's called collaborative professionalism. And so it's really, in a nutshell, it's nothing about you without you. And so we try to kind of make sure that teachers are involved in all of the processes and decisions that we make to try and make some sense out of it, because the research is clear. Leadership is second. Principalship, so leadership, official leadership in schools is second only to classroom instruction to ensure that students can in fact move the needle. And so we pay a great deal of attention to ensuring that teachers are part of the development of the work that we do. And finally, the third piece that you identified was the socio-economic piece. And I think that many folks have already spoken about this, but the whole idea, if we continue to speak about 21st century skills, I think we're about 17 years behind. So it's really about talking about that notion of global competencies and innovation, which we've tried to integrate. And oftentimes you'll hear folks talk about global competencies in terms of those skills that are necessary currently. So things like collaboration, critical thinking, citizenship, global citizenship, and other things like that. For me, I think global competencies has a couple of components attached to it that were part of your study. And for me, one of it is that it ought to have a body of knowledge, both theoretical and practical. And we can debate whether Shakespeare ought to be taught in the classroom or not, and all of these other debates that can kind of ensue in education. But essentially, there's a body of knowledge. And then there's a skill set that you spoke about. And that skill set, I think, is ever changing. It's dynamic, and we need to pay attention to its dynamism. So I think that, by just sort of picking the skill set currently, I think we do some disservice as to where we need to be. And then finally, I think more importantly than that is the ability to act ethically. And I think that students, and again, we can debate who defines ethical, so on and so forth, but I think that notion that somehow or another that students graduate with the ability to see injustice in the world, be able to point it out, and to act towards it is an important component of that skill set of global competence.
So I'd like to sort of drill down a little bit into sort of one of the categories, the middle category, which comprises the biggest share of it, which is the teachers. So what are the concrete steps that Ontario takes to really build teacher capacity so that they don't feel like they're just sort of chained to a textbook and chained to a curriculum, and that they can really kind of create a classroom environment where students can cultivate all these skills that you were discussing?
Yeah, and primarily I think the response to that is that we trust their professionalism, and we trust it in a multiple of ways and build their capacity. We often, start from models of scarcity as opposed to models of abundance, So oftentimes people talk about all of the things that we need and should have, so on and so forth, when there's lots already present that we can work with. And so with our teachers, that's one of the areas that we find as well. They're willing to give all of their time, more of their time, so on and so forth, as long as we kind of focus the discussion to get to where it is that we need to do, where we need to get to. So the great gift that we have in Ontario is that we have an education system whose curriculum is expectations-based. And students can demonstrate those expectations in multiple ways. They don't need to demonstrate them only with the paper and pencil test. And so equipping our teachers and building their capacity in order to kind of have them understand how to assess appropriately to know that students are in fact delivering what the curriculum expectations are is one of the key areas that we've worked with concretely with them.
And moving to kind of the society pillar aspect of it, Canada is, obviously it's quite unique among the sort of the community of nations in that it is so diverse. And so, teachers and policymakers, like yourself, you're bringing your own backgrounds to it. It's, a melting pot environment. How does the education system really reflect Canada's sort of diversity and strength in diversity?
Yeah, an excellent question again. So in Canada currently, in the country, 22% of the people that live in the country weren't born in Canada. In Toronto, where I work, 51% of the people that live in Toronto and in our schools were not born in Canada. So it's an extremely diverse, and just in 2016, we welcomed 10,000 Syrian refugees in terms of the country. So in terms of the province. So it has all kinds of shifting demographics and working with it. And we need to pay attention to what it is that we're asking students to do and be like. And so we spend a great deal of time trying to understand sensitivity and bias, even in providing students an opportunity to answer questions appropriately. So, very concretely, you place a question on a test or an assessment whereby you ask a student to find the area of a garden after you've mowed the outside and the inside and what's left over. Oftentimes students have no experience of a garden. Right? And so it doesn't provide them with access to that particular question. And so we need to get better at working on the student narrative and assessing the student narrative as opposed to kind of immersing ourselves in textbook narratives and trying to kind of assess a textbook narrative, which we're quite comfortable doing. So it's a little more work, but I think our teachers are getting there.
And Canada's been showing sort of an admirable amount of leadership on the world stage in recent months and years. Sort of what is the role that it's taking now in the education space, I guess? Is there, sort of more impetus to, engage with other nations, especially ones that might not be as fortunate as Canada?
Oh, very much so. I think from both the learning and the teaching perspective, I think that Canada looks to others and tries to kind of go out and be involved in some promising practices that are taking place around the world and trying to kind of bring them back. And as we know in education, as you look at promising practices, we often talk about knowledge mobilization. And the difficulty sometimes with knowledge mobilization is it becomes replication. And it's not about replication, it's really about integration to try and kind of find those promising practices, bring them back and be transformative in how they apply to us in our particular situation. And it ought to be the same for the rest of the globe as they sort of look at some of the promising practices that we have, to be able to take them and not necessarily replicate them, but to make them more transformative for their circumstances and situations. And we have some great thought leaders that we've been involved with for a number of years. Michael Fullen's in the audience tonight, and he sort of has helped us move the needle in terms of his new pedagogies for deep learning. Andy Hargraves and others have been instrumental in kind of supporting our work. So we've looked outside of ourselves to try and kind of see who some of the thought leaders are globally and try to kind kind of really take their work and try to kind of instill it in us and go deeper with what it is that we do, as opposed to kind of 1 inch deep and a mile wide, to really kind of go the mile deep and an inch wide.
Mm-hmm. And in our sort of preparatory chat, you had mentioned the idea of sort of putting the child at the center of education, sort of as a counterpoint to the idea of education as a tradition, and it's kind of something that's passed down from teacher to student. How is this sort of in practice in Canada, and what kind of advice would you give to other countries' education systems which are trying to do this or thinking about it?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think the child is the moral purpose of everything that we do and ought to be at the center of all of our discussions. Second to that, I think that countries and Ontario needs to have, especially anyone in education, I believe, ought to have some strong understandings and deep beliefs about what they believe about teaching and learning. And I say that in terms of, personally, these aren't simply, sort of platitudes that one can espouse to, but for me, the deepest beliefs that I hold about teaching and learning, I believe that all kids can learn, and that simply means all kids, not some of them. I believe that the teacher controls the conditions for success. I believe that time is a variable in learning, and I believe that teaching isn't complete until learning has taken place. I think teachers get paid for students to learn, not to teach. And that's a marked difference in terms of where we go. And I think countries ought to kind of be able to understand that more deeply and demonstrate that in terms of their teaching and learning continuum. Based on that, I also think that countries ought to pay more time in terms of being able to understand deeply the whole notion of equity and well-being. And finally, I think that these are great places to incubate wonderful ideas in terms of moving them along, because we really do need groundswells. Because if you rely on us as government, we recognize that some of the best ideas in government meet their death through committee. Right, and we see that often. We kind of will over-committee everything, and it never really gets out into the field. And we really need to take time and try to kind of move from the groundswell up and see what people are thinking and what students really need, and how to engage parents more than information, but really to kind of engage them through empowerment to kind of get a feel for what we need to do and move education forward.
So I'd like to ask, just sort of in the last few minutes we have left, sort of one kind of challenging question, basically about money. And yourself as a government minister, I'm sure it's something that concerns you a lot. But in our index, at least, Canada ranks relatively low. 30th out of 35 economies on the percent of GDP spent on education, and only a little bit better, 17th out of 35 on teacher salaries. So what is the link there? I mean, what is this something that Canada should be improving? Is it trying to improve, or what's your view on that?
We certainly need to pay attention to it without any question. I mean, in Ontario, we recognize that, in terms of where we sit relative to the GDP, we spend about a little less than 5% relative to the GDP. However, when we look at the entire budget, we spend about 27% of the budget of the province is on education, and second only to health. But what we're starting to recognize more around this again is that we can't silo education in some way, shape, or form within governments. We recognize that they ought to be interministerial in many ways. And so when we speak about mental health, for example, we recognize that health has a responsibility along with education to provide for mental health. When we speak about environment and climate change, we recognize that those ministries have a responsibility along with education to educate young people as to what the UNESCO goals are around sustainable development as well. So we have the sense that we've constantly worked in silos, and more as we look forward and look at where the economy is going in years to come. Unless we're in a more integrative kind of approach, I think we'll miss out.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's pretty good. Just about at time. So thank you all for listening in, and thank you, Deputy Minister Rodrigues.
Thanks.
It was wonderful. Great conversation.
Thank you very much to Michael Gold, editor of the Economist Intelligence Unit, and Bruce Rodrigues, Deputy Minister of Education, Ontario in Canada. He's responsible for early years and childcare.